In this segment, we'll talk about race from a biological and social perspective, inequality and privilege, and the construction of whiteness. It's commonplace in our society for individuals to talk about race and assign people to racial categories. In fact, this is referred to as racialization, assigning people identity based upon categories that we've constructed. In fact, the idea of race, there's a lot of misconceptions here. A lot of people think it does represent actual biological differences, and there's no question that when we look at each other, we see different skin tones, we see different types of hair, we see different eye shapes. There are clearly physical differences between us. However, on a genetic level, on a biological level, there is no grounds for the idea of biologically distinct humans. So from a biological perspective, race just doesn't exist. Instead, race is a social construct. And we're going to explore that a little bit further, seeing when and how it emerged over time. And even the idea of whiteness is a social construct with a very specific history traced to the United States of America when that term was first used. With respect to race, the American Association of Physical Anthropologists, they point out their revised UNESCO statement on race: all extant or living humans belong to a single species and share a common descent. Variation has been shaped by environmental, nutritional, and cultural factors. So there's no question when we look around us, we do see phenotypical differences. But with respect to our genetics, we are very similar, and they do not justify the idea of biologically distinct humans. Charles Darwin pointed out that variation was a basic feature that we find within any species, and humans were no different. There's a lot of variation between us. With that said, we've already pointed out that there's not enough variation to create separate species. But when we look at specific groups, we do see variation between us. For example, the so-called white or Caucasian, and we're going to talk about that term in a minute. But the so-called Caucasian race, there's a lot of variation between Europeans. Now, variation, it's not a bad thing according to Charles Darwin. He says, in fact, this is how we adapt, and it leads to the success of a species. We adapt to our environment, and we see changes. With respect to the idea of constructing races, people traditionally have focused upon skin color. For example, here we have a number of individuals that would be classified as belonging to two different races, okay, and we can see these phenotypical differences between the individuals in skin pigment. However, let's add a couple more there. Now, how many races do you see if we use that traditional biological model that people have applied? Say what, at least 1, 2, 3, 4. And what I'm getting at here is if we're just looking at skin color, individuals that fall within a particular race, we do see a great amount of variation between them. So it becomes very difficult to classify people according to skin color, and we shouldn't do that. We can't engage in racialization, but people nonetheless use the term race as a social category to construct identity. Charles Darwin pointed out that variation is a common feature or a basic feature that we find within any species. Humans, we're no different. Variation provides us with the genetic tools that allows us to adapt to our environment. And that's selected for over time, leading to this process of natural selection or survival of the fittest. And we see a number of different phenotypes, a number of different skin pigments, for example, and features. And what that tells us is that stuff allowed our species to be successful in our unique environments. Now, here's kind of the irony when we look at variation. There's more genetic variation within so-called racial groups than between them. And when we take a realistic look at the differences or the so-called similarities that constitute a racial group, it becomes a little bit confusing. So what features are typically used to create races? Well, we have these phenotypical features. Let's write that up top. Okay, so our phenotypes. And when we're referring to a phenotype, this is the physical features that we see. For example, skin, pigment. So here we have a row of individuals that we might be tempted to place into racial categories biologically on the basis of those phenotypes that we see, skin pigment. And if we expand this to include a few more individuals, and like I said, there's a lot of variation within racial groups. The question becomes, how many different so-called racial groups do you see here? Now, how many racial groups do you see? It becomes confusing because what becomes the measure that we use to define whether or not somebody belongs to a racial group? This is one of the reasons why anthropologists prefer to use the term ancestry. We do trace our ancestry to specific regions. We do have genetic markers that link us together. However, when we're making these judgments, that's exactly what we're doing. We're racializing and we're placing people into groups based upon perceptions that I might, for example, have. And in doing so, I construct identity for other individuals. And that's something that we want to avoid. Our readings refer to the work of Angelica Doss, who is responsible for producing what she's referred to as the human Pantone chart. And in it, she challenged the idea that there is a visible dichotomy between black and white. In contrast, what she has tried to illustrate is humans exist in a spectrum of color. And there is, yes, a whole lot of variation, as we see in this particular slide. But the differences aren't as clear as just black and white. Now, what we're going to learn is the idea of whiteness and blackness. They are constructed, and it has everything to do with politics and economics in the United States. As for the variation that we see, you're probably looking at this thinking, wow, there's a lot of variation. There must be some really significant biological differences here to produce dark skin pigment and very light skin pigment and everything in between. The fact of the matter is, humans, all humans, are 99.3% to 99.9% genetically identical. Okay, so that really tells us that there's not enough of a genetic difference between populations to construct this idea of biologically distinct humans. To give an example, if we look at the differences that we saw on the last slide with skin color, pigment is mainly shaped by one gene, SLC24A5. And this gene is on the long arm of the 15th chromosome. And what ended up happening around 12,000 years ago is there was a shift on the 111th position, and an amino acid changes from adenine to threonine. And here, this produces light skin. So to answer perhaps one of the questions that a lot of students have in anthropology, they say, what was the original color or skin pigment of humans? The original pigment was dark. And eventually, at around 11,000, maybe just a little bit earlier, in around there, evolutionary anthropologists are still trying to work that out. But in around that time frame, we start to see a new feature begin to emerge, light skin pigment. And in fact, it's not until around 6,000 BCE, okay, 6,000 years before the Common Era, that we start to see a wide or a broad sweep of light skin pigment starting to become normal among individuals living in cooler regions of the world. I'm going to take you back in time just to preface this slide. Let's go to the Pliocene. This is 5 million years to 2.5 million years ago, MYA. And it's during this epoch that our Australopithecine ancestors became fully bipedal. So they became bipeds. They were walking on two legs. Now, this provided them with an advantage. Okay, it reduced area on the body that UV radiation could act on. And the result was ultimately a cooling effect. And we didn't overheat. So we could take advantage of the warmest, the hottest periods of the day while quadrupeds rested in the shade. And that allowed us to collect resources. As we move a little bit further in time and we get to the Pleistocene. Okay, so we're in the Pleistocene, and that's 2.5 million years to approximately 20,000 years ago. MYA will say 0.02 MYA. And it's during the Pleistocene that we continue to see changes. For example, increased sweat glands, loss of body hair. So that's taking place, and that's exposing skin to UV radiation. Okay, so now we have exposed skin, and you can imagine that this isn't really an advantage in a very hot environment. So the adaptive advantage that took place at this point of time, approximately 1.5 million years ago, according to literature, we get dark pigment. So dark pigment, it has been a feature of our oldest ancestors, and it is something that modern humans, when we emerged 200,000 years ago, we had dark pigment. Now, as for light pigment, I think a lot of people don't realize that this is something that's very recent. Light skin gene mutations, they occurred around 12,000 years before the present. And in and about modern day Georgia region in near east, okay, or Anatolia area, that's where we find the first evidence for genes that contain this SLC24A5 mutation. And that gene, SLC24A5, it's mutated at that position 111, and it's starting to produce light skin pigment. Now, light skin pigment, it offers people in low UV environments an adaptive advantage. It allows them to obtain more UV radiation, and we know that vitamin D is absorbed or at least synthesized through UV radiation, and that's something that's essential to survival. So we have this increase in vitamin D absorption. So here we're looking at light skin pigment as another type of adaptive advantage. And I'm just going to go over the side back to dark pigment. And here perhaps I'm jumping the gun, but I'm going to point this out now. Here, the advantage of dark pigment, and a lot of people think that it's probably related to cancer. It's not. What ends up happening if you're exposed to too much UV radiation and you have light pigment, your body's stripped of folic acid. And the problem is, if your body is stripped of folic acid, you're not going to be able to successfully procreate or reproduce. So dark pigment prevents the body from being stripped of folic acid, and our species goes on to reproduce successfully. Now, as for when we see a lot of light skin beginning to emerge, it's not until about 7,000 years before the present that we see a broad sweep of light skin pigment. So a very recent evolution, an adaptation. Either way, when we look at light skin or we look at dark pigment or the tones in between, they provided our ancestors with adaptive advantages. It allowed our our ancestors to be successful. It's ironic that the very thing that led to the success of our species, and here I'm not engaging in a hyperbole, skin color led to the success of humans around the world. If our earliest ancestors didn't develop dark skin, we would not be here today. It's just that serious. And the same thing could be said of northern populations throughout Europe. If they didn't develop that light skin pigment gene, they wouldn't have been successful. And it's ironic because eventually people begin to use that feature against people. The thing that led to our success is used to oppress individuals. Carl Linnaeus, while he wasn't part of the pseudoscience and scientific racism that began to emerge, he did set the stage for it. He was the father of taxonomy or classification. So he began to classify species according to genus and species and subspecies. And in doing so, he argued that there were varieties of humans, which eventually becomes races. Now, Blumenbach, he's the first individual to use the term Caucasian or Caucasoid or Negroid, Mongoloid, Australioid. So he creates these variations based upon geographic regions. Morton, he continues that approach and he begins to argue that certain races are superior to others. And he does so on the basis of measuring cranial capacity. Now, as you're going to find out in your readings, Morton, he was entirely fraudulent in his research. There's a lot of data that he ignored. He fudged the data. He really produced a study that proved what he intended to prove, or supported what he intended to prove, that whites were on the top of the evolutionary hierarchy and everything could be rated on the basis of color as you progress from light to dark. And this really, it fits into the history of racism in the United States of America and elsewhere. These were widely popular ideas. Let's move to the next slide. Now, Blumenbach began to mix science and religion. He was looking for the location of Eden and the resting place of Noah's Ark, Mount Arafat, and he had determined that Eden was located in the Caucasus Mountains, and people from this region, he argued, had always been white, thus Caucasian. So these first categories that begin to emerge within racist science are based upon geographic regions, and this is why we don't use Caucasian, because it is connected to a racist history that sought to argue that one group of individuals was superior to another. Now, the idea of white as a racial category, this was also constructed. Whiteness has had symbolic connections. For example, in the UK, early symbolism is traced to non-laboring classes. Individuals who didn't have to go out and work, they were wealthy, and that's what pale skin came to represent, wealth and privilege. Even if we think about tuberculosis or consumption, the idea of whiteness was tied to being poetic, being a deep thinker, some of the symbolism at that point in time. But it didn't exist as a racial category. In the United States, whiteness, it emerges as a legal class of individuals. But interestingly, it didn't include all individuals who we might refer to as white today. Who did it include? It included American colonialists, Protestant individuals who settled the United States of America, and they were defined as white. And they were privileged in the sense that they owned property and they had voting rights. They could be part of the political apparatus. For example, some of the early slaves that were brought to the United States of America, it wasn't just indentured slaves from Africa. It also included Irish individuals, because in the UK they were defined as less than human, not quite equal to other individuals, and they were not perceived as white people. Nor were Eastern Europeans, Germans for example, individuals coming from the Ukraine, they were not defined as white either. And that was during the 16 and the 1700s. Eventually this is going to change. Apparently the first reference to the idea of whiteness as a legal term is traced to the Virginia Act 1691, and it privileged American colonialists. As pointed out, it didn't privilege anybody else who was part of a slave trade, whether they were Irish, if they were German migrants, or other Eastern European individuals. They didn't fit into that legal definition of being white. Now, 1741, there was this event, it's referred to as the conspiracy to destroy New York. And what ended up happening were African slaves and poor working class individuals, they started to revolt against the political power at the time. And there was a number of riots and fires set as these people revolted against the individuals that held power. Now, in an effort to put an end and separate African slaves and poor working class non-white individuals, for example, Irish and German individuals, they gave new rights to the Irish, German, Eastern European individuals. They were redefined as white individuals in the United States of America, and they were allowed access to property and politics. The other thing that happened at this point of time is when Irish individuals would escape from slave owners, they could blend into a population by the nature of their skin color. You could change your accent, you could change your last name, but the fact of the matter is, for a visible minority, they couldn't engage in that process. So here we start to see the emergence of whiteness, and it's tied to property and politics. And if you reflect upon the way that people are talking about white today, white privilege, it is tied to that Virginia Act in 1691. And the privilege that's associated with being white has continued throughout time. And this is something that we do, and we're obligated to think about how certain individuals have been privileged in a society while other individuals haven't. So if we want to talk about privilege, we can talk about health and health disparity. Because at no point of time in the land of the free, the United States of America, has a minority group ever approximated the health status of a white American. And even if the white American is poor, there's a great amount of disparity that exists. And this is tied into this idea of race. With respect to health disparity, then, we could say that health disparity represents this difference that we see between populations. And it has everything to do with access to the medical system, access to the political apparatus, access to the economic system, and education. Certain individuals do not have the same access as others. And of course, we're going to see that some individuals who are defined as white have greater access to resources than poor white individuals. But when we compare what those individuals have in contrast to minority populations do not do as well as even the poorest white populations. Whites have been privileged. Health disparity, it refers to differences in morbidity and mortality and life expectancy in and between populations. Morbidity, let's just get a marker here. Morbidity, it refers to the incidence of disease. And mortality, it refers to how many individuals die as a result of disease. So we're seeing that with COVID-19. Populations do have different morbidity and mortality patterns, and minority groups continue to suffer and have a greater burden of disease than dominant groups, white populations. So health disparity, it refers to the unequal health treatment and care that people get based upon the color of their skin or the racial group that they've been assigned to. If we take a look at life expectancy, for example, so-called white females in the United States of America, they have the greatest life expectancy at 80 years of age. Black females, they have the second greatest life expectancy at approximately 75 years of age. White males at 74.8 and black males at 68.3 years. So it's this difference that we see between the populations that we refer to as health disparity. And you'll note not only are we seeing differences between white and black Americans, we're also seeing a difference on the basis of one's sex, whether or not they are male and female. So looking at disparity, there's a number of differences that we can look at here: sex and race. Let's take a look at another example. So fetal mortality rates in the United States of America per 1,000 live births. We can see that if we draw a baseline here, working from our, what am my marker here? From the white non-Hispanic. Okay, so that's going to be our baseline with the lowest fetal mortality rates. We can see how high black non-Hispanic groups are. So we're going to call this health disparity. And how do we account for those differences? And we can't say biology. We've already discussed that there are biological differences. Now, some of those biological differences that might impact the development of a child, they're going to be tied to economics and prejudice and racism. It might be tied to the area that one lives in. For example, black populations disproportionately live in areas in the United States that suffer from very high lead poisoning. It's in the ground. Okay, and I'll show you a slide on that a little bit later. But here we're looking at another example of health disparity on the basis of that social race. Let's take a look at one more. For example, the differences between blacks and whites in the United States of America. Asthma rates. Okay, so we're seeing much higher asthma rates among blacks than whites. The question is, why? And we're not going to look at the biology of this. This is related to the social determinants of health. Okay, all of those factors that eventually build up over time that limit or don't privilege an individual in the same way as other populations. So here we can look at a couple of explanations that provide us with some insight into why we see these differences. And here we're using the example of health disparity. So in the 1900s, a sociologist by the name of Max Weber, he argues that class, lifestyle, and life chances are intertwined. He says that social classes, they're based upon access to power, property, and prestige, such that our class ultimately impacts the way we live or our lifestyle, and that will have an impact upon what we can achieve in life or our life chances. So here we can argue ultimately that we begin to have these structural explanations. Individuals are born into specific classes, and that's by and large impact upon the race that they belong to socially and the options that are available to them. And you can imagine here, looking on the right-hand side of the screen, if we're having individuals who are living in the projects, for example, What quality of education are they getting? And we have to look at this as a child needs to have good education, no matter how bright they are. And they could go on to do great things if they're nurtured by good educators and an environment that works towards getting these individuals to go to school. However, in the projects, for example, we in the ghettos, there isn't the same amount of emphasis that we find, for example, if we go to an area of town where people are sending their children to private schools. They're privileged in a different way, and that's going to impact what they can achieve in life. Now, what they can achieve economically, for example, that's going to have an impact upon their health, and that's going to produce disparity. So our structural explanations, they want to point out that the class that an individual belongs to, and that's tied into race as well, it's going to affect one's life chances. And because people don't have access to health because of these structural barriers, it's going to produce great differences between populations. So not everybody has the same access to food. And one of the things I'm going to point out here, this is how important is a healthy breakfast, a good start. A lot of kids don't get a good healthy start. Our brain requires or consumes 33% of our daily energy, more than any other muscle in the body. If you don't have a good breakfast, children are at a disadvantage. So economics is going to be tied into education. Insurance, education, not everybody in the United States, for example, has the same access. And we've also learned that in Canada, individuals do not have the same access to education based upon the areas of town that they live in, and that has to be rectified. In addition, based upon where people live, some people live in very toxic environments, biologically toxic environments, so the pollutants that are in the area, and also culturally or psychologically toxic environments. And both of those are going to have an impact upon one's life chances. Let's take a look at a few examples. What we're looking at here is a relationship between life expectancy and years of education. So as education increases, so from less than 12 to 12 years of education to 13 to 15 years of education and 16 or more years of education. I'll go to my marker here. Okay, so our 12 years of education, and we're looking at different years. Let's go with the red. 2008, average life expectancy was 73 years of age. In 2008, with 12 years of education, it goes up to approximately 78 years. 2008, looking at life expectancy for individuals had 13 to 15 years of education. They're approximately 83 years of life. And if you have 16 or more years of education, you're pretty much 84 years for your life expectancy. It's a one correlation. Education and life expectancy are correlated, and this is one of the reasons why we have to reflect upon the quality of education that is provided to individuals, that it is the same no matter what area of town that you live in, and no matter what the population in that area is, whether they are white or black, whatever the so-called social race is. The education needs to be equal, and people need to have the same access and be privileged in the same way. With respect to income and life expectancy, we see the same type of relationship. Now here we're looking at GDP, and what we find is Africa, with a low GDP, the average life expectancy is in and about 53 years of life. India, this climbs to just under 65, we'll say 64. Brazil the GDP is going up, so too is life expectancy in about 73. And the United States of America and Germany, we're seeing upper end. So again, we're seeing this relationship as, I'm going to switch over here to a red marker, as GDP increases, so too does life expectancy. Again, we're talking about access to resources and the structural barriers within society, the systemic racism, the institutional racism, in addition to individual racism, but the systemic racism that prevents people from achieving in life and denying them to fully participate in the society. As for biologically toxic environments, Kyle Bridges laid down in the middle of McCullen Street on his way to school. He rested his too small head on his book bag, and he told his brother just to go on without him. I'm sick of living. I'm just going to wait till a truck runs me over. Don't worry. I just want to die. The issue here that we're looking at that's described in this excerpt, Kyle had suffered from plumbism. The lead was in the paint, the lead was in the walls, it was in the ground. So another problem associated with the area of town and those structural barriers that prevent people from achieving. It has a profound impact upon their life chances. And just to give you some insight into the extent of plumbism or lead poisoning in the United States, here we're looking at Detroit. And in 2001, there were 16,773 children tested who had unacceptable of lead in their blood. It was in the paint and it's in the water pipes. And here what we're looking at is every dot is a child under 6 with lead poisoning. Well, the question becomes, can we correlate this with race? White Americans versus African Americans, United States of America. Blue representing African Americans, the red bar graph here representing white non-Hispanic Americans, and in homes, for example, older than 1946 and homes that are newer than 1946. And we can see that the lead poisoning rates are drastically higher among African Americans than they are among white, non-Hispanic. And looking at the averages, first to the left, black versus white. Again, this is another structural barrier, another determinant of health. At risk of belaboring the point, here we can take a look at one more example. Non-Hispanic white populations in red, lower levels of blood poisoning. Native American, Alaska natives, also lower levels of blood poisoning. And we look at non-Hispanic black populations in green. We see that they have the highest amount of blood poisoning in comparison to other groups. And this really, I think, illustrates the problem with privilege, systemic racism, and the history that's led to the problems that we see in modern day times. We can also talk about toxic environments from a cultural or a social level. And here I want to take us back to Emil Durkheim, who wrote a book in the 1800s in 1897 that was called Suicide. And in that book, he challenged the idea that suicide was driven by psychological factors. Instead, he pointed out that suicide had a lot to do with the amount of solidarity that existed in a society or social capital. So working from this model, we can say that social solidarity or that glue that binds us together as people, it plays a really important part in health. And where social capital is low, mortality is going to be higher. So we can reflect upon some of the issues that people have been talking about, for example, with respect to racial profiling, or where individuals feel like they're constantly being targeted. And we know that this exists. We've seen it in the United States of America at the forefront in recent times with the Black Lives Matter and the murdering of a number of Black individuals. And we've seen it in Canada with Black and Indigenous individuals. They don't feel safe in their communities. They feel that people aren't looking out for them. So it's in these type of environments that we see lower social capital, perhaps, arguably, at least according to the model. So where we do find lower social capital, the mortality is going to be higher. The lack of social goods and social solidarity, in the end, it's going to play a role in creating disparity. So in the end, we can look at race and racism, and here we're looking at an image on the right hand side from the internet. Racism makes me sick. It makes me sick in one way. I'm disgusted by racism. But as for individuals who experience racism, it makes them sick as well, not only on that level of disgust, but physically, mentally, socially. It's a real problem. So race and health disparity, we look at hypertension. It's not correlated with racial genes. Instead, it's connected to society. It's connected to culture. It's connected to a long history of racism. So the denial or denying individuals full access to society and to fully participate in any given society, whether or not we're talking about education, economics, trust, all of this stuff decreases life expectancy and creates disparity.